Thank you very much for joining us today for a new session of our TeTra Text and Transmission Seminar. And our speaker today is Rachael Helen Baines. Until recently, she was a postdoctoral researcher at the Austrian Academy of Sciences in Vienna, where she worked on the project Epigraphies of Pious Travel. Last summer, she was a summer fellow in Byzantine Studies at Dumbarton Oaks as well. And in just a few weeks, she will join our project Generative Authority here in the Faculty of Protestant Theology at the University of Vienna. Rachel's main research interest is late ancient and Byzantine graffiti, on which she wrote her doctoral thesis at the University of Birmingham, where she also did an MA in antiquity and a BA in ancient history. A contribution of hers came out this year on the Greek Byzantine graffiti and the Grotto of the Bathing in Bethlehem in a volume on the graphic signs in the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. And last year, she published an article in the journal Byzantine and Modern Greek Studies entitled Personal Responses to Danger in Greek Graffiti. And we're now eagerly awaiting several other publications by her on various aspects of Greek Christian graffiti. Also for those who are in Vienna, she's delivering a paper on Tuesday, the 26th, on Byzantine pilgrims graffiti from the 5th to 15th centuries at the Institut für Klassische Archäologie. In the meantime, she's going to talk to us today about a fascinating graffiti, which she mentioned to me a while back. As you may imagine, I could not resist inviting her to speak in this seminar, as text and transmission does not only involve manuscripts and papyri, but definitely also inscriptions and graffiti. So I'm looking forward, as I'm sure you are, to hear about this peculiar graffito. Rachael, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the lovely introduction, Andy, and also for the introduction to speak today. I take every opportunity I can to speak about this graffito, so I'm very glad to do so today. And especially in this context. So yes, I'm very excited and thank you. I will just try and... I tried to share my screen and I closed Zoom, so that's a great start. Is that... There we go. That should work.
Yes.
So, yes, my presentation today is
Perhaps
Fowl Demon, demonic duck graffito at Didyma in its wider epigraphic context. And this is based on research I undertook for Epigraphies of Pious Travel and will hopefully be published in some form soon. So before I begin, I would like to discuss a common street sign that is visible in the UK. If the PowerPoint will change slide, which it won't. What is happening there? Now it will. This sign provides a warning to motorists. Men are at work in this area. Please do not hit them with your car. The visual language of this sign is familiar to anyone who has spent any time on a British road. The triangular shape indicates that this sign is a warning, something only reinforced by its bright red border. We are shown what to be wary of. The simplified image within shows a human figure undertaking manual labour. The road sign adheres to the visual canon of British street signs, and its meaning is immediately recognisable to the intended audience. But what I have not shown you, however, is this sign with its text added. Upon Googling this sign, it is not uncommon to find the following text attached. Warning, man opening umbrella ahead. Now this text immediately transforms the image. As viewers, we are forced to confront the absurdities of the road sign we so intrinsically understood. The central figure does not represent a man doing manual labour, rather it looks like someone opening an umbrella. Notably, this interpretation does not deviate entirely from our prior understanding. It is still clearly communicated that this sign is a warning, as the red triangle has already alerted us. But the text manipulates this visual language in a playful way. It takes a serious warning to which we must adhere when driving and turns it into a joke. Now, today's presentation is not on humorous interpretations of British road signs, but the example I have just shown you highlights some of the themes I will be discussing, namely the interaction between image, text, and the ways they can manipulate one another. Instead, I'll be providing a different case study, the example of the demonic duck graffito from Didyma. But very quickly, before I begin, I just want to define graffiti, which I'll be doing so today in accordance with Mark Handley's 2017 definition. Graffiti is an informally carved text placed secondarily on either living rock or an existing structure or monument. And although handily focuses on text, images and figurative inscriptions can also be included. I might also use the term informal inscriptions to refer to graffiti. But before discussing the demonic duck itself, I'll keep you on tenterhooks. I briefly want to examine Didyma and the informal epigraphic landscape of the site. Located in southwest Asia Minor, the most famous structure at Didyma and the location of the duck Graffito is the Temple of Apollo, later converted into a Christian church. The earliest inscriptional evidence of Apollo worship at Didyma dates to the 6th century BCE, although the extant temple was probably built in the 3rd century BCE. To the immediate south, bordering the temple, was a stadium for athletic events, and a theatre has recently been discovered in the immediate vicinity, perhaps dating to the Roman period. Christian activity at Didyma is recorded from at least the 4th century CE. According to Sozomen, himself writing in the 440s CE, several martyr shrines were constructed close to the temple before their removal under the orders from the Emperor Julian, who reigned from 361 to 363 CE. The temple continued to function as a pagan cult centre until perhaps the late 4th century. The final conversion of the temple to Christianity occurred in the late 5th or early 6th century CE. And this 5th or 6th century church was in use until at least the 9th century, when it was destroyed in an earthquake. A smaller church was built in the ruins of its predecessor, but scarcely lasted longer and was destroyed in the 10th century CE. So in general, any of the Byzantine or late antique graffiti I discussed today are those which were probably carved during the Christian use of Didyma, so between the late 5th and the 10th century CE. And Didyma is a palimpsest of inscriptions, in particular informal texts and images. Many graffiti from the site can be confidently placed in the late antique era, often due to overtly Christian symbolism incorporated either into the inscription or surrounding it. For example, those textual and figurative graffiti which reference the Christian deity, we have one graffito carved on a wall which reads Kyrie Jesus Bethi, or Lord Jesus help. Crosses and apotropaic signs such as the Solomon's Knot are also found carved within the former temple precinct or nearby areas, attesting to Christian visitors who wished to leave behind evidence of their piety after they had visited the site. Graffiti at Didyma also attests to the inhabitants' and pilgrims' participation in civic life. Multiple graffiti attest the circus factions, the institutions responsible for organising public entertainment in the Roman and Byzantine world, the most prominent of which were the blue faction and the green faction. One graffiti on a paving stone, for example, reads Nike itiki prasinon, or May the fortune of the Greens triumph. Place inscriptions indicate the presence of guilds, corporations, and merchants at the temple church. An inscription on a column base, identifiably late antique again due to the following Christian prayer, reads, Place of the pawnbrokers, Lord help them. In amongst the Christian iconography, board games such as the popular Duodecim Scripta and also Pentagrammi are found, attesting to leisure activities undertaken by board worshippers and other citizens in the area. So with all this context, we can move on to the actual point of the presentation. And this is a figurative graffito. It depicts a man on the left wearing a long tunic and holding a spear and shield. To the right of the man is a bird perched on the branch or vine. Images of animals, armoured figures, and conflict between the two are common in the late antique urban environment, where they have often been interpreted as munera, beast fights and gladiatorial combat put on for performance in the circus or theatre. For example, at Aphrodisias, also in Asia Minor, and with a very high percentage of late antique graffiti found, we see multiple different representations of munera. In the large urban park at Aphrodisias, a graffito depicts a human figure fighting a bird, probably an ostrich, and another graffito from the same city shows a man in a kilt with weapons. Given the close proximity between the temple church, the stadium, and the theatre at Didyma, it seems more than possible that the graffito depicts a beast fight. This is bolstered by the graffiti referring to the circus factions and thus public entertainment located within the precinct. If these combative figures were the only information available about this graffito, I'd be reasonably confident in identifying the depiction as munera, or perhaps a hunting scene. However, I have withheld some information. Accompanying the graffito is an inscription. Above the representation of the man and the bird is the text, Piapia demonizomenos. Demonizomenos is very clear. It means demon-possessed. The previous word is more obscure. The first editor of this graffito, Albert Reim, did not offer a translation, but his interpretation is made clear through his description of the bird, which he labels as enigmatic, duck-like. This description suggests he interpreted the first line as a variant of papia, duck. Papia was vernacular for duck and does not appear in written Greek until the 14th century CE. There are a few other anomalies in interpreting this text. Most notably, papia is feminine, while demonizomenos is masculine, and we would expect the gender of both words to match. Although I wonder if this inconsistency can be explained by piapia being an early variant of the word. And although the appearance of papia in Greek postdates the abandonment of the church at Didyma, it is possible that the word was in use in spoken Greek much earlier. The Triantafallidis dictionary suggests that papia was an onomatopoeic word, mimicking the noise made by a duck. If this is the case, then the similarly repetitive piapia could easily be an attempt to replicate the duck's quack. An examination of the bird depicted in the graffito affirms this interpretation, particularly when compared to other examples of early Byzantine art representing ducks. Byzantine ducks were depicted with long torsos, webbed feet, and long beaks. They are often shown in the wild or in rural scenes surrounded by vegetation. The bird in the Didyma graffito has a long torso and beak, and what may be talons on the feet could be also an attempt to represent webbing. Now, I do want to say the 2 days I spent just Googling pictures of Byzantine ducks in order to reach this conclusion is perhaps the most enjoyable of my academic career. The most likely interpretation of this graffito is demon-possessed duck, accompanied by a depiction of the infernal waterfowl and a man in military garb. The demonic duck graffito has no parallel in Byzantine graffiti of which I am aware. In order to understand this graffito, it is necessary to first understand demons in Byzantine culture, then ducks, and how these two interact in this text and image. Now, although the concept of demons did not emerge with Christianity, it was nonetheless a fundamental part of lay religion and the early Byzantine concept of the world. Demonic possessions proliferate throughout the Bible, with Christ being called upon to heal the afflicted, the most famous example coming from the Synoptic Gospels, where Christ expels a collection of possession was thought to be a key cause of illness, both mental and physical, in the early Byzantine Empire. Amulets, prayer, and other means of intervention could both prevent possession and provide relief to the afflicted. Within amuletic texts, demons are frequently compared to dangerous and wild creatures, such as the snake, lion, or crocodile. One recurring magical formula, here from a variant found in an amulet from the British Museum, reads, "Why do you munch like a wolf? Why do you devour like a crocodile? Why do you gore like a bull, and why do you coil like a serpent?" When zoomorphic demons are depicted on amulets, it is typically as one of these monstrous creatures. A common iconographic representation includes the demon, a snake, being vanquished by a heron. Conflict with demons is another feature present on amulets. Typically, they sometimes feature a military figure vanquishing the demon. The Holy Rider was an iconographic representation of a figure, either Solomon or Saint Sicinios, atop a horse, spearing the female demon Gelu with a lance. Alternative depictions include King Solomon whipping a demon. This depiction would represent the exorcism manifested by the amulet itself. This lexicon is superficially mirrored at Didyma, in which the demonic creature of the duck is vanquished by a military figure. At a former temple, where negative spirits were believed to proliferate, the demonic duck could have been intended to act as an apotropaic symbol, exorcising a zoomorphic demon from the new church. But despite this superficial alignment, the creature depicted within the graffito belies the interpretation of the text and image as protective against demons. Unlike the crocodile, snake, or lion, ducks were not presented as threatening beasts in early Byzantine art. Ducks were instead associated with earthly or spiritual abundance and pastoral bliss. In monumental domestic architecture, ducks were often featured as evidence of the wealth and plenty of a country estate. For example, in the 4th or 5th century mosaic of Dominus Iulius in Carthage, a duck is one of the products of the estate presented to its mistress. A depiction of a goose beside a vine at Tabarka in Tunisia is remarkably similar to the duck atop the branch in the Didyma Graffito, with ducks also present in this idealised rural mosaic. Mild ducks were explicitly paralleled with dangerous game in a mosaic from Sicily. At the Via Romana del Casale at the Piazza Amarina, the 3rd century Great Hunt mosaic depicts hunters capturing big game animals, ostriches, lions, and elephants. The Small Hunt mosaic in the same villa shows hunters capturing boar and deer. But an additional mosaic from this building parodies these depictions. Children are shown hunting less dangerous creatures, the hare, the pheasant, and the duck. The depiction of a child hunting the duck bears distinct similarities to the duck graffito from Didyma, with the duck perched in flight on a vine opposing its hunter. The consistent depiction of ducks as non-threatening and their association with the pastoral ideal undermines an interpretation of the duck at Didyma as a threatening demon. Rather than apotropaic, it appears that the Didyma duck graffito was an intentional perversion of amuletic imagery. The depictions serve not to deter demons, but to mock them. The graffito borrows the visual language of protective amulets, an armed military figure versus a demon, and substitutes the demon for a non-threatening waterfowl. This is a joke, which is largely obscure to modern audiences, but would have been understandable to its author, although they were perhaps still a little worried it was obscure, hence the decision to include a label. More pertinent, however, is how this graffito is illustrative. Graffito was occupied with thoughts of evil spirits and divine protection, but this was not manifested through prayers and Christian symbolism in forms of the cross, but a joke at the visual language of divine protection. The demonic duck is one of the most enigmatic graffiti from the early Byzantine world. Upon initial examination of the image, it would seem to represent Munera, feast fights and competition within the circus, and something that would make a lot of sense in a context at a space which was evidently at the centre of civic life. But this interpretation is shown to be false by the addition of the text. Instead, we are encouraged to reframe our perception of the image. Just as in the man at work sign I showed at the beginning, a common part of the early Byzantine visual canon is reframed into humour. We are able to identify the bird as a duck and the image as an intentional perversion of apotropaic imagery more common in amulets. Through substituting a lion, serpent, or similar vicious beast with a duck, the inscriber has rendered the image absurd. Not only does the demonic duck provide us a rare insight into early Byzantine humour, but it highlights the indivisibility of text and image in art and the ability of one to manipulate our interpretation of the other. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for this paper that was at once enlightening and entertaining. It's a great pleasure for us now to open the floor for questions, for discussion. So please, to all audience members, if you have questions, feel free to use the raise your hand function on Zoom, or indeed to write down questions in the chat. We can also read out questions for you. Shlomi, please, for the first question. The floor is yours.
So first of all, thank you very much, Rachel. That was hilarious and pretty wonderful. Thinking about this strange figure, I was reminded of the depictions of the War of the Pygmies, or a Pygmies war with the I think it's cranes in Pompeii, which appears in both in literature and in iconography as a kind of mock war or some political war. So could it be related to this picture of men fighting a duck, which is related to another question or thought, building on the beginning of the presentation with the sign, which we only understand depicts a man holding an umbrella when we see the writing underneath. Could it be that the inscription was added to an already existing picture? So perhaps, I mean, someone interpreted it maybe, again, mockingly as a demonic duck, whereas in the beginning it was meant only to show, I don't know, someone fighting a duck in a, who knows what. What would you think?
So thank you so much for your question. I'm not actually familiar with these images from Pompeii, so I will look those up. That sounds very interesting and definitely something I should look into to get an idea more of this humorous visual canon. Oh, I've unshared and now it won't let me share again. Apologies. Regarding the question of whether these could have been carved at different times, the answer is certainly yes. It is a possibility and one that needs to be considered that this was someone coming and later adding the text. But fundamentally, I don't think this is likely. If we look at the figure and the text written above it, they both appear to be carved at the same depth, which suggests they were maybe carved with the same tool. Similarly, you can see where the tool has sort of struggled and like the lines are slightly uneven. These are very similar in both the image and the text. So I think it's most likely they were carved at the same time by the same person with the same tool. This cannot, of course, be said with 100% certainty, but I would say it's probably 95%.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I wondered if I could maybe ask a sort of question for information, more or less. So, are you aware maybe of literary sources where ducks and their characteristics are discussed? I don't know, the physiologus or maybe aliens characteristics of animals, where you find depictions going into a different direction or in a similar direction of ducks as not at all dangerous.
So thank you so much. I've actually not delved too deeply into the literary sources. I definitely should do. The one I'm familiar with is, I believe it's Varro, but I might be misremembering because it was a long time ago I read it, discussing how to care for ducks. And this makes it very clear that they were rather simple creatures to care for. They weren't seen as particularly problematic. You just built them a little enclosure and let them be. Um, as I say, I'm not familiar with too many other sources. I've mainly focused on the representations in art, but I would really like to look up any more literary sources that discuss them.
Thank you so much. We have space for further questions at the moment.
Madalena is
Well,
waving
I
her
think I
hand.
have a question.
I'm sorry, Madalena, I looked to you, please.
Yeah. No worries. So thank you very much, Rachel. That was very interesting and funny as well. So I have a question about the use of humor, because of course this is one of the main things of your. So how often is to find humor in these graffitis? And well, I know that there are also root words and stuff like this, but this seems more of a, I don't know, constructed joke. So it's a bit of a different register and all that. But how often is again to find humor in general, and how, yeah.
So, in terms of So one of the huge problems we have with specifically late antique and Byzantine graffiti is due to the nature of buildings which have both survived and been excavated. Most of the material we're looking at is found in religious spaces. And while it's not unheard of for people to carve non-religious graffiti in a church, there are a few attestations to the circus factions or games. It's rare. Almost all graffiti which has survived from church spaces is explicitly religious in some form. So we only have a few locations where we're really able to look at graffiti which has confidently been dated to the late antique period, and is what we might call secular. So our data is very limited in this respect. That being said, there are definite examples of humour that we find, particularly at Aphrodisias in Turkey. The two that jump to mind that are particular favourites of mine is a Graffito from the Stadium, and one thing, or possibly the theatre, I can't remember off the top of my head, but one thing that was very common was for people to place inscriptions on the seat, saying this seat is reserved for Julius, Claudius, whoever sat there. And we find both official and non-official seat inscriptions. There is one inscription which seems to almost parody these, which is written on one of the seats, and without using too much vulgar language, reads, "I am one who is sexually penetrated." So whoever took this seat was, as a result, declaring themselves someone who is sexually penetrated. Similarly, from behind the stage of the Odeon in Aphrodisias, there is a Graffito which reads, "Karmadikianos is one who is sexually penetrated." Rather than just an insult, this does appear to be maybe a joke at a specific performer. Carved very close by to this is a signature inscription of someone called Karmadilianos. This is not a very common name, so it seems likely they referred to the same individual. And Karmadilianos' name is carved underneath what may be a representation of either imperial statuary or some form of performance which was happening in the Odeon. So it's possible that Karmadilianos, being a well-known actor who portrayed himself in these sort of imperial fashions, was being mocked by a friend, or possibly not a friend, and colleague. So these do appear. We do definitely have examples of humour, but they, other than ones which are overtly rude or insulting, they're quite often hard to identify. The graffiti from late antiquity in the early Byzantine Empire, even in secular spaces, tends to be very, very formulaic, using the same language and same phrases again and again. So what's really exciting about the Graffito from Didyma is the fact, because it has this very unusual description, we're able to identify it as a humorous Graffito that we wouldn't have been able to do without the text added. We would have just, as I say, interpreted it as Munera and not really thought much deeper. So they exist, but this is unique insofar as we can absolutely identify it as humour in ways that wouldn't be possible without both the text and image.
Thank you. For the next question, let me turn to Dan, please.
Thank you very much. Fascinating. Always nice to see this sort of material, especially when you get a quirky turn on something like this. I was wondering about pia pia. So this is a word that only appears a couple of centuries later, and it could be onomatopoeic, right? One of the ideas. And I wonder, because there are languages today where pew pew is still the onomatopoeic sound used for small birds, even. That's my language. I'm Romanian. Pew pew, it would be the sound of a smaller bird, even. And I wonder if in the chronology, compared to when the word emerges as a specialized word for that bird, if that's an onomatopoeic sound entirely, if that doesn't even enhance the joke, the duck can stay a duck in the representation, even a threatening duck, but even the duck can be parodied with the onomatopoeic sound rather than with a specialized noun for a type of bird, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so that makes complete sense, and I think that's very likely. So the term itself, Piapia is actually my interpretation of the graffito. The previous publication just had it as Papia. However, I'm pretty sure this is inaccurate. What Albert Rehm interpreted as just the alpha, I'm fairly confident you can see there's actually a iota before it. And that iota and alpha seems to match very well what could be an eta, but I'm pretty sure is a iota and alpha in the final letters, even though they do slightly touch. So yeah, I'm by no means a linguist, and I'm very hesitant to speak too much on the emergence of the word as a result. But I think you're absolutely right that this is onomatopoeic, and whether it is in fact one of our earlier attestations of a variant of Papia for duck, it's definitely mimicking that sound. And yeah, as a result, I think is very fun. I like to think of it in my own head rather than reading it as demon-possessed duck. As a very literal English translation, I like to think demon-possessed quack quack. But duck
Indeed.
is more alliterative and easier to discuss.
It's easier to discuss. Well, I mean, it's obviously visible from the image. If not, so it's visible also the iota next to the final alpha. But I mean, to go with Papia, we do have, there is a very visible iota B after the second, as the second letter in the word. Yeah, I would go with you on this. And when would be this graffito dated and based on what? I mean, I'm curious whether the conversation on the dating of this is hooked on the Pia Papia word, and people try to date it on the basis of when the word appears, or there are other things. I don't know. Thank you.
So this is one of the very difficult things about this graffito. I very strongly lean to the fact it must have been carved between, or it was most likely carved between the 4th and the probably 14th century. It was certainly, I think, it's difficult. The problem I have with Piapia de Menos is this phrase is so unlike anything else I have come across in late antique graffiti. It is so different from the typical formulae we see. One of my initial reactions when I first came across it was to go, well, this must be later, this must be early modern, this must be completely unrelated, because I'm not familiar with it, having looked at quite a large collection of late antique graffiti. But I don't think that is the case. From my rather rudimentary understanding of paleography, this certainly can be Byzantine. It definitely doesn't look early modern. Another problem, of course, is could it predate the Christian use of the temple? I personally don't think it does. Carved in close proximity to it are several overtly Christian images. You can see a cross is just to the left. And although this is not carved at the same depth and with the same instrument, it shows that people were carving Christians were active and carving symbols in this area at the time. There is very possibly a cross before the word Theminos and Menos. I have included it in the image I created, the sketch, but this is very, very faint, and barring an opportunity where I'm able to go see it on site, I would be hesitant to say that cross is certainly there and it's not just damage to the stone or a visual trick. If we do assume the cross is there, which I think it probably is, we are looking at after the 4th, 5th century. I think it makes sense that this was carved when the church was actively being used. After the destruction of the church within the temple, a later Byzantine church was constructed within the area of Didyma, but not in the temple itself. So I think it was more likely carved when people were active worshipping in this space, but that can't be said for 100% certain. Artistically, I think it looks late antique. It certainly looks similar to the images of Munera. The bird upon the vine is paralleled in several different late antique representations. But I've not looked enough into later Byzantine art to say with certainty they didn't depict ducks like this. So at the moment, 4th to 10th century is my guess.
That makes sense. It's how we date these things.
Thank you so much. I wondered if I could maybe quickly build on that last question. Rachel, during your talk, I was reminded of the Alexamenos graffito, where a donkey-like figure is suspended and its backside is shown. And there it seems that one argument is, of course, that this is mocking Christian practices or mocking a Christ-like figure. And another argument has been made that this might be Christians mocking pagan or Egyptian divine figures. So I was also curious if in this late antique temple church-like context, you also discern further traces maybe of religious connotations to this mockery or to this joking.
So that's really interesting. I've not considered the possibility that it was a non-Christian mocking Christian practices. I think that's very interesting. And it certainly could be. One of the reasons I'd be hesitant, it all comes down to Piapia and when it emerged in Greek, and I'm so uncomfortable providing a conclusion to that. It could be earlier. No, all I can say is that's very interesting. If there is the cross, I think that's unlikely that was carved by a pagan mocking it. If there isn't the cross, that obviously raises alternative interpretations. But fundamentally, if the cross isn't there, it's very possible this was earlier and was a pagan themselves mocking ideas of demons which did predate Christianity. So while I'm fairly confident in saying it's humorous, and I'm 80% confident saying it's late antique, early Byzantine, it could be a pagan mocking their own faith, Christians mocking paganism, pagans mocking Christianity. That's something I hadn't considered. That's very interesting.
Thank you so much for reflecting on this. Andy, please.
Thanks very much. Lovely stuff. I'm really happy. Really happy that this turned out like what I was expecting. So now that we have a specialist on graffiti in the room, I have sort of because I have no experience with this whatsoever. So in terms of graffiti and dating, in terms of the sort of mechanics and psychology of applying these kind of things, and you've mentioned that this graffiti, it's surrounded by there's other ones in the vicinity. Is there any kind of sort of psychology behind it, where do you place it on a stone or a stone in a wall, on which side of the building in relation to another one? Can you discern anything from this? Sort of which one's first or these kind of things?
So just to clarify, do you mean which graffito was created first out of a palimpsest, or?
Well, also one next to another one, these kind of things. And also in terms of sort of, are they all on high? Would they all have been on eye level? Or would you put other ones in certain different areas? All these kind of things, sort of the place on the building and on the wall and in relation to each other. Sorry, it's a very big question. So you can answer it as short as it and as long as you like.
No,
Yeah.
It's a really fantastic question. I'm really glad you asked it because it's something I'm very excited about when discussing graffiti in terms of how that shows us used space. there are lots of differences in terms of whether graffiti was intended to be visible, whether it was a person making their own choice to leave a memento behind for them so they knew it was there, or whether they wanted other people to see it. This varies a lot depending on context. In terms of where graffiti is placed in the building, one of my favorite aspects that is true with the demonic duck graffito and many of the others at Didyma is that they are written on the floor. So these were people sitting down to create them. I think that creates a lovely vision of the sort of early Byzantine and Roman world, where you have people lounging in shaded spaces, perhaps waiting for friends. One of the fantastic things, I will jump back in the presentation, is the game boards, which are also carved on the floor. This shows people were sitting there and sitting there for extended periods of time, because not only were they able to carve the boards, they were able to play them. They were able to leave them behind for other people to play. Once a game board is there, it can be used any number of times. Now, we do have some graffiti from the walls at Didyma. I have not been fortunate enough to visit a lot of these spaces yet, so I'm not 100% certain on exactly where they were. Were they at eye height? Were they lower? However, that's something I am eagerly trying to do. I've submitted an application to try and get funding to go to Aphrodisias this summer to try and see for the first time where some of the graffiti is placed on the wall, and I'm fingers crossed I get to do that. But yeah, I just think graffiti is such a lovely attestation to how the city was used. And rather than these cold spaces with purely formal texts and people moving in and out, we can actually see that these were very busy spaces in which people took their time. And we can see through clusterings of graffiti where people were likely to be. One of the fascinating things in Sagalassos, also in Asia Minor, there's a whole series of steps that are covered in graffiti. So not only were people sitting on these steps, they were probably sitting in people's way. This was not a space people were running in and out of. It was one where they had to interact with the people taking up space in front of them. I really love, also in Sagalassos, but also places like Aphrodisias, where we have place inscriptions which show vendors. These were usually carved on columns. But I love to imagine that you have people surrounding them. They might carve their inscription on a column, but they were probably sitting at their like stall in front of it, because people needed to be able to see the graffito, so they can't just stand in front of it the entire time. So yeah, this is one of the things I really love. I think it's such a lovely way of actually seeing how people used city space, that there's very little other sources that can tell us that.
Thank you very much. I wondered if I might again jump in with a very short question, if you wouldn't mind. Rachel, when we think of modern informal inscriptions, one response upon seeing it might be admiring the colors and the figures, maybe seeing it as a form of artwork. But a potential other response could be to disapprove of it, to see it as a violation, maybe, of public space, or to warn one's children not to touch it, or responses like that. Would you see the informal descriptions like the one you have shared with us? Would you see them in that light as well? Would this have been welcomed, or do you have any inkling of ways people might have responded beyond interacting with it or playing with it? Or
thank you so much. This is a really fantastic question, and it's one I've devoted a lot of time to. I've recently finished writing an article which discusses this topic. I'm just trying to shop around for a journal to send it to now. I will try and keep the answer short rather than going in the 2-hour long spiel I could talk about for this. There's a few different interpretations. It is very common in graffiti scholarship to assert people had no problem with graffiti. It's so ubiquitous. We find it everywhere. People clearly did not object to it. It was just a part of daily life. I have a problem with this claim because I would say in the modern age, we see graffiti everywhere. It is ubiquitous. It is a part of daily life. But that doesn't prevent there being laws against it. So I find that argument that the sheer number of graffiti shows that people didn't disapprove fairly weak. That being said, I think it is almost impossible for us to understand how people truly viewed graffiti in the ancient and medieval worlds. There are some texts which seem to suggest disapproval. There is one author who, when describing his pilgrimage to Jerusalem in, I think, the 15th century, talks about how the Muslim guards at various churches gave them a long list of things you weren't allowed to do, and one of them was carve graffiti on the walls. Whether that was because the Muslims really had a problem with people carving on the walls, or whether they just wanted people moving through the space as quickly as possible, you don't know. Similarly, the author himself complains about individuals carving graffiti, but his complaint is less about the fact they were carving the texts, even though he disapproves of it, and more about the fact that they were carving their own sigils and names rather than anything pious. So there's layers to what was considered acceptable in each space. I think the really, really difficult thing, sorry, I get so excited speaking about this topic, is in the modern era, graffiti is a financial crime. The belief that private property is sacred and that individuals carving their names, creating murals, adding street art to private property is a direct assault on the financial value of a space and people's right to maintain financial value. This is something that has only emerged in the past century, less than that, more like the past 50 years. The word graffiti does not appear in any modern language until the late 18th century. It explicitly appeared in archaeological contexts to describe scratched inscriptions found at Pompeii. It only really starts emerging to discuss the modern phenomenon in about the 1940s. So we're looking at less than a century of graffiti even having a name in most Western languages, at least. So we have millennia and millennia of history in which people were carving and writing things on buildings, and there wasn't even a term to refer to this phenomenon. Graffiti was only made illegal in the UK in the 1970s. The word graffiti does not appear in British law until the 1990s. I don't think we appreciate all the time how recent condemnation of graffiti is, and that condemnation exclusively emerges in legal contexts from graffiti as a crime against property value. So, and when ideas like that of how property value are so baked into our cultural understanding of the world, in which we have a very, well, this is my space, this is your space mentality, I truly don't think we can even begin to make judgments how people in 500 CE would have understood their addition to buildings. I'm certain there are people who disapproved. I'm certain most people didn't care, but it's a mindset we can't even begin to comprehend.
This is fantastic. Thank you so much. And I think we shall look forward to your article. And let me also, on this note, thank you all for joining us this morning, and mainly thank our speaker, Rachael Helen, for this brilliant talk.
Thank you so much for inviting me.